Thank you very much, Jeff, and thanks to all of you for attending this morning. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Okay. So thanks, Jeff, for the introduction. Again, thanks to all of you for showing up so early in the morning. I'm Josh Bongard. I'm going to talk a little bit about robots and particularly Xenobots today. But before I do, I wanted to thank all of you, the educators that are there today. Uh, Obviously, your job is very challenging, very important, and as we all know, there's several viruses and politicians who are influencing how you do your job. I just wanted to start as a member of the public by saying this, and I'm sure you don't hear this enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all the important work that you do. So in terms of K-12 education, I'm just a fan. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the technical work in my lab and some ideas we have for bringing robots out of the lab into the classroom. And I've left plenty of time at the end of this session for some Q&A so that hopefully we can brainstorm and think through possible curricular ideas around robots and xenobots and related technologies. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm a roboticist, and because I work on robots, they are obviously the coolest thing ever. We like to bring them out of the lab and into the classroom. This is a short video of a class of grade 2s. And in this case, I've brought Quadrupedia with me. She is the small four-legged robot you see sitting on the table. And as you'll see in a moment, I'm going to start remote controlling Quadrupedia with some hand gestures. For those of you that do teach our very young kiddos, you'll know that it's particularly challenging to capture and hold their attention for any considerable period of time. You'll notice a few things in this video. The first one is that Quadrupedia has absolutely no problem whatsoever with capturing and holding the attention of every single student in this class. This video is only a few minutes long. This was a half-hour demonstration with Quadrupedia. She was able to hold all the students' attention for all 30 minutes. Not an inconsiderable achievement here. Among this group of young people, of course, there's a few future doctors, engineers, mathematicians, scientists. Those kids, I think, they're going to succeed in their professions. They're going to build new technologies and make scientific discoveries, more or less, regardless of what we do as educators. Among this group are a lot of other students that are going to become artists, writers, lawyers, politicians, regulators. I'm particularly interested in those students that are STEM adjacent. They're going to grow up to not directly create technology, but I think we have an opportunity as technologies become more accessible, like Quadrupedia here, more accessible for people to interact with these technologies and hopefully learn what's under the hood and grow up to be meaningfully engaged in our social discussion about what kinds of technologies we want to create, regulate, and deploy in the future. So I'm hoping when we get to the section on thinking about curricular activities, there's some obvious math and science curricular activities around robots and xenobots and synthetic biology, but I'm interested in some of the other curricular ideas we might have for some of the non-STEM modules in our K-12 classes. Okay. So I'm a roboticist, sometimes a scientist. So when I do visit a classroom with very young students, they sometimes ask, or their teachers prompt them to ask, what is a scientist? What does a scientist do? And I usually answer that question with another question, which is, what would you like to be when you grow up? And as you all know, some of the common answers are, I want to be an astronaut. Some students respond, I want to be a detective. I want to solve mysteries like I see on TV. You hear a lot of, I want to be famous. And so I usually respond to that with, imagine you could grow up and have a job where you get to be all three. As a scientist, you get to explore the unknown. And if you're really lucky, sometimes you see something that no human being has ever laid eyes on before. You get to spend a lot of your time trying to solve mysteries. Most of us scientists spend our whole careers trying to solve mysteries, and we don't solve them. We just make the mystery more mysterious, which is a win for a scientist. And if you discover something that's particularly surprising, maybe you as a scientist don't become famous, but the thing that you discover does become famous. And I wanted to talk a little bit about one of those things today, which is the Xenobot. I just wanted to pause for a moment, and I forgot to thank Beth, who I know is also live drawing as I speak. I can't see what Beth is drawing, but hopefully she's giving you a visual representation of what Xenobots are. Before I talk about the Xenobots themselves, I wanted to pause for a moment and travel back in time several tens of thousands of years to visit our distant ancestors. Throughout human history, so far, we've discovered 3 different ways of shaping living systems to support human wants and needs. Obviously, the oldest of those 3 methods is selective breeding. Our ancestors very, very slowly changed the breed on the left into the breed on the right. I don't think anybody would argue that dogs and horses and domesticated corn and wheat enrich and improve human lives in many, many different ways. The disadvantage, of course, of selective breeding, which we still practice today, is that it's relatively slow. So the second way we've invented to shape living systems to support human wants and needs is, of course, genetic engineering, which is about 50 years old at this point. Here's a particular GMO. This is golden rice that you can see on the right. If you eat golden rice, it will help your body to produce vitamin A. Unfortunately, 250,000 people die every year in developing countries from vitamin A deficiency. You can take my word for it that it is a particularly horrific death. It is not a way that you want to go out. GMOs are, of course, a very controversial technology, and I would point out that most of the resistance to GMOs tends to come from developed countries where there are mostly well-fed people who do not suffer from vitamin A deficiency. There is resistance to GMOs in developing countries as well, but it is definitely asymmetric. And this is a little bit of my personal opinion coming through. This is not my professional opinion. The point I wanted to make with GMOs here is that a lot of emerging technologies are controversial, and it is often very instructive to pay attention to who is lobbying against or lobbying for a given technology. Xenobots are a very new technology that are also controversial for different reasons from GMOs, but I think there's meaningful discussions to be had amongst ourselves and with our students about why these controversies exist and the human motivations behind those arguments. So in just the last 3 years, it's my distinct honor to have been involved with the team that invented a third way to shape living systems to support human wants and needs. And these are computer designed organisms, or CDOs, more popularly known at the moment as Xenobots. So as Beth is drawing there, let me help her out by trying to paint a visual picture here for you about what Xenobots are. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail today about how they're made and what they are. Obviously, I can't do them justice. I can't explain in detail how they work, but hopefully to give you a good sense of what they are and what they might do in future. As you can see, Xenobots are very small. They're about 1 millimeter across. They're perfectly happy in about room temperature fresh water. And if you watch a bunch of Xenobots swimming about in pond water in a petri dish, what you would see with the naked eye is what looks like specks of black pepper moving about in an aqueous environment. You can see hopefully you can see, or maybe barely just see, one of these Xenobots trapped under glass. Xenobots are living robots. They have no technological components whatsoever. They are 100% biological. They are also genetically unmodified. The current generation of Xenobots are built from frog cells, and they are cells taken from a particular frog species, which is Xenopus laevis, or the African clawed frog you can see on the left. So Xenopus, Xeno gives us Xenobot. Xeno in Greek also means stranger or newcomer, which we thought was also kind of an apt name for this emerging technology. As I mentioned, I'm part of the team that created the first Xenobots. This project started back in 2019, where 4 of us received funding from DARPA, which is the research wing of the US Department of Defense. So this project was already controversial before we even created the Xenobots, which are now themselves controversial. This is an interdisciplinary team. So there's myself as the roboticist and my PhD student, Sam Kriegman, who at that time was a computer scientist with me here at the University of Vermont. We received this funding to work together with 2 biologists, Mike and Doug, who are at Tufts University. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got started. But since that time, our team has grown. The Xenobot team is now much larger, and I'm going to just talk about the first generation of Xenobots today. The new work on Xenobots led by Caitlin and Gazem and Krishna and Hale and Vaibhav has not yet been published, so I'm not at liberty to talk about what they're working on at the moment, but stay tuned. There's some pretty amazing things coming down the pipeline. Okay, so as I mentioned, we received this funding back in 2019, and at the beginning of this interdisciplinary scientific project, we had 2 techie people and 2 bio people, so we had to learn about what the 2 groups were capable of. So we had a set of weekly Zoom calls, and on the first Zoom call, I showed some of the work from my group. We have worked for a number of years on traditional robots, which are made from metals and plastics and ceramics and electronics. This particular robot is the evil starfish, nicknamed by one of my students, and you can probably see why. This robot is a lifelong learner, meaning that during its lifetime, if something surprising happens, like for example, it loses part of its leg, which you can see in the right-hand panel, it's able to use some AI or some intelligence to figure out how to start moving again. So we were explaining a little bit about our robotics work to our 2 biology colleagues on the Zoom call, and the next week, Doug, who's a microsurgeon, came back and showed us this picture of something he had created over that intervening week. And there was absolute silence on the Zoom call while we were all trying to digest or figure out what it was exactly that we were looking at. And Doug explained that he had been sort of interested and inspired by our 4-legged robots that we had shown the week before. So Doug sat down to see whether he could create a sculpture of these 4-legged robots out of cells. And I'm going to just show you a few videos now of how Doug actually made this very first Xenobot. We're going to travel down through the microscope with Doug, and we're going to watch Doug, who's a microsurgeon. He's going to surgically create or build a Xenobot. He starts by taking a few very early frog embryos from mother frog. These are basically frog eggs. Frogs tend to lay several billion eggs at a go, so hopefully she won't miss a half dozen of them or so. Doug is very, very carefully using microsurgical devices. He is removing the animal cap. It is a particular part of the early embryo or the early egg that contains skin stem cells. Skin stem cells are particular stem cells that are destined to become a particular type of skin cell. And I don't know whether you can see it in this video, but you'll notice that there's this white material that's being liberated from the egg. And this white material is a whole bunch of these very, very small frog skin cells. You'll see it a little bit better in this video here. At this point, Doug has extracted about 6 animal caps, and he's removing the gray material. This is ectoderm. This isn't useful for building. It's not useful as a building material. The underlying white skin stem cells are very sticky, and hopefully you can see some of them floating around in the Petri dish here. Once Doug has collected enough of these skin cells, he places them in a very small well or concavity in the bottom of the petri dish. And you'll notice that these individual cells don't like to be on their own, and they are actually moving a little bit on their own. And they're trying to actually re-aggregate or come back together. The reason why they do this is a big mystery. And this is one of the mysteries that sort of spun off from the Xenobot work. They are in a way, quote unquote, trying to recover from this very surprising event. They're trying to connect with their neighbors, and one might think that they are trying to reboot or restart their collective task, which is to build an adult frog. It turns out, and one of the most surprising things for many people involved and outside the Xenobot project, is that they're not necessarily trying to build adult frog, that they can be deflected or influenced or convinced to build or help to build something else. These early skin cells are very sticky. They're kind of like balls of cellophane tape. They kind of move around, and once they hit into one another, they stick together, and they gradually form sort of a mass of skin cells. And at this later part in the process, these cells have matured a little bit. They've become a little less sticky. And so Doug is going to go back in again with another set of microsurgical tools, and he's going to gradually scrape away unwanted material. He's basically making the four legs of this Xenobot here. The way that Doug goes about creating or building one of these Xenobots, it's a very creative process. Doug doesn't drink caffeine. He's got very, very steady hands. He's like a concert pianist, very, very skilled. This is very delicate work, very creative work. As I mentioned, one of my personal interests when it comes to outreach is how do we reach creative types that aren't necessarily interested in computers or robots or technologies per se, but they want to be meaningfully engaged in our technological future. The Xenobots, I think, are one of these technologies that demonstrate there is definitely a place for creative types in the technological and biological technologies of the future. So this is Doug creating technically not a Xenobot, it's a xenosculpture. It's only made from skin cells, so this thing can't actually move on its own. Once Doug had explained to us, roboticists and computer scientists, what this was, you can imagine what our obvious next question was, which is, could he build one of these things that actually moves? His answer was maybe. Doug explained that he knows how to pull out from frog embryo skin cells. He can also pull out stem cells which are destined to become heart tissue or heart cells or myocardiac tissue. Heart cells in the frog and heart cells in a human are cells that will increase and decrease their volume. They get bigger and smaller. During development, those heart cells, when they come together and attach together, they form a hollow shell. Those heart cells talk to one another and they synchronize their actions so that they all decrease their volume together and all increase their volume together. And that produces a pump that pushes fluid out of the pump and pulls fluid into the pump, and you get a frog heart or an adult or a human heart. So Doug explained that he could possibly use these heart cells that increase and decrease in volume like tiny little pistons or motors, and he might be able to incorporate them into a Xenobot sculpture to get this thing to move. We asked Doug if he had any ideas about where to place skin and where to place heart to get a robot that moves, and his answer was, I don't know how. He knew how to get the raw materials, skin and heart cells, but he didn't know how to put them together in the right combination to create a machine that does something that we want it to do, which in this case is just to walk along the bottom of the Petri dish. So we turned this design task, which was beyond a human, which was beyond Doug, we turned this task over to an AI. And that AI lives inside of UVM's supercomputer, which exists in the Technopark out in South Burlington. So the very first computer designed organisms were designed by a computer right here in Vermont. This is the deep green supercomputer, and here's a few photos from the opening of that facility a couple years ago. We thought it was particularly apt that frog robots were being designed by an AI that lives inside of a computer called Deep Green. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the AI side now, about how the AI actually designs these Xenobots. You saw a little bit already about how they're manufactured. So this AI is a piece of code that's running inside this supercomputer, and this code is actually not that complicated. It's running a very simple recipe or a very simple algorithm, which is basically trial and error. And it's basically a computer code that does exactly what our human ancestors did tens of thousands of years ago when they were selectively breeding wolves into dogs. Same approach, but done using an AI rather than human beings. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how this works. So what you're watching now is we've sort of dove inside the computer and we've put on our matrix goggles where we've turned the code into something that we can see visually. What we've done at this point is we've asked the AI to figure out how to combine simulated or virtual frog skin cells with simulated frog heart cells. And the task for the AI is to figure out how to combine those two types of Lego bricks in a way that the design will start to move from left to right along the bottom of the virtual Petri dish. The AI, like Doug, has absolutely no idea how to do this. So it starts by creating some random designs. At the beginning, it creates 100 random designs. You're seeing 3 of those 100 designs in the video here. You'll see that in the top animation, there's mostly blue voxels or 3D pixels or cubes. These blue cubes are meant to represent bits of frog skin cells. And frog skin cells are passive and soft. They can be pushed and pulled. So skin tissue obviously is passive and deformable. The red-green voxels, if you kind of squint at this, hopefully you can see this. The red-green voxels are getting bigger and smaller. You'll notice, hopefully you can notice that the red-green voxels do not synchronize. So we asked Doug, if you take heart tissue and rearrange it in a shape other than a frog heart, will heart tissue synchronize? Doug's answer was, we don't know. So we built that uncertainty into our algorithm here. And so the heart cells do not synchronize. They're basically like randomly acting parts. Imagine trying to build a reliable machine that in this case walks from the left to right along the bottom of the Petri dish, but you have to build that reliable machine out of unreliable components. That is a task that's very difficult. It's beyond most human engineers. Another aspect that's surprising about this project, and that I would argue makes AI particularly creative, is that it's able to solve this problem. You'll notice that these 3 designs do not move along the bottom of the Petri dish very well at all. It turns out that the 3rd design, the one at the bottom, actually moves about 1 millimeter to the right. It does a little bit of what we want these Xenobots to do. So this algorithm, this piece of computer code will latch on to that design. It will delete the other 99 designs, and then it will make 99 copies of that surviving design. And when it makes those 99 copies, it introduces slight random changes. It puts a heart cell where a skin cell used to be, or vice versa. It adds a cell, it removes a cell. And by repeating this process over and over again, where it deletes the slow-moving Xenobots and makes randomly modified copies of the surviving, faster-moving Xenobots, after about 2 weeks of running this piece of code on UVM's supercomputer, the AI gave us back this particular design. And you'll notice that this Xenobot does what we wanted it to do, which is to move from left to right. You'll notice it's got these randomly acting parts. And you kind of have to visualize this, but if you watch the trajectory, the way in which the Xenobot moves, it moves in more or less a straight line. So this AI has solved this very difficult design task. It's been very creative. It's built a reliable machine out of unreliable parts. We took that design and we sent it to Doug, our microsurgeon, and Doug again went to work building this Xenobot. In this case, he's building from skin and heart tissue. And after a few attempts, Doug was able to create the physical Xenobot that you see in the bottom panel here. You can notice a few things. The first thing is that it doesn't quite have the same shape as the AI's design, and it also does not move in exactly the same way, but more or less what we wanted. It's moving from left to right along the bottom of the physical Petri dish. So this video that you're watching here in the bottom, this was the very first computer designed organism or living robot, something that was designed by an AI to do something that humans wanted it to do. Okay. We published this work back in January 2020, and as you can imagine, if you have AI-designed frog bots being funded by the US military, that definitely caught the attention of a lot of global media outlets. Xenobots ended up on CNN, the New York Times, BBC, the New Yorker. And after the global media response to this technology, we got on Twitter and saw the public's response to Xenobots. You can probably imagine what those responses were like. Some of the responses were negative. Obviously, why would we go about creating such a technology? Most of the people that were providing negative comments or sort of fear about this technology, generally speaking, tended to be in an older demographic. A lot of people found this technology amusing or maybe surprising or unsettling. Most of the people that had sort of a humorous response to this were sort of the 20-somethings to 30-year-olds. Those would tend to tune into The Onion or The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. There's a third set of responses, which was typically from very young folks, which was they were extremely excited about this technology. This is an anonymized email that I received from a 15-year-old aspiring synthetic biology researcher. She told me that a few days ago she learned about Xenobots and she was just the most excited she'd ever been in her entire life. Baby frogs that can move, self-heal, and interact with one another. She feels a strong desire to change the world with Xenobots and began reading about articles, research papers, and was very willing to learn and wants to create a future where Xenobots swim about in our oceans, chasing down cancer cells and increasing our lifespans. This is just one example of many, many emails and tweets that my colleagues and I received about the Xenobots. And as I mentioned before, this is clearly a controversial technology. There are many, many regulatory hurdles we're going to have to get over if this is ever going to be a useful technology someday. But it's interesting to think about these breadth of responses to this technology and the demographic distribution of who responds in what way. We also received a lot of emails from K-12 educators. This is from a 6th grade teacher in Maine. Over my career, I try and seek out current science research that shows students what the future might hold for us. When I found articles on the Xenobots, I couldn't believe my luck. The debate we had last year in class was incredible. Even during the pandemic, when motivating students was challenging, the students were engaging in debate about the Xenobots. There's a fourth type of response that we got to this technology, which are sort of philosophical responses. One of the most common questions we got is, what are the Xenobots? Are they a frog? Are they an organism? Are they a robot? And so just carrying on with this email from this teacher, he pointed out there was a lot of this discussion and argument in his classroom where some students were arguing this is an animal, this is a robot, it's something completely new. As a teacher, I felt that this discord, these concepts that aren't black or white, allow students to take intellectual chances and push their reasoning skills further. So this teacher was very kind to bring myself into the classroom via Zoom, and we had a fantastic discussion with these students, primarily around their thoughts on what exactly Xenobots are and aren't, and what they may or may not become in the future. So I think there's a number of entry points to interesting curriculum we could develop around Xenobots and other kind of surprising technologies that are at the interface between biology and technology. A couple of other surprising things about the Xenobot that are great points of departure for discussion is that if they are robots, they often act very different from the robots or the machines that we currently have. What you're watching is Doug pinching a Xenobot almost in half, and over a few hours, that Xenobot will gradually repair itself. I challenge some of our students to think about what would happen if you cut your laptop almost in half, or your cell phone obviously in half. Obviously, it's not going to recover. If we as a society want to make machines out of living materials, one of the advantages about building machines out of biology is that you get a lot of function for free, like self-repair. An individual cell is a fantastically complex and capable machine, and cells have had 3.5 billion years experience dealing with or going to the school of hard knocks. Cells can take a lot of abuse, and they can figure out what to do to recover whatever it is that they're trying to do as a collective. And again, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there about technology, human societies, working well as a group, that are discussions beyond just, Xenobots and the biology itself. More recently, in December 2021, we introduced Xenobots 3.0. I showed you Xenobots 1.0. We don't have time today to talk about Xenobots 2.0, so I'm skipping ahead to Xenobots 3.0. Xenobots 3.0 do something particularly surprising, which is if you litter a petri dish with individual frog skin cells, which we already talked about, and you can see those individual cells in the dish. Particular Xenobots, like the one that you see here, they will move about in the dish, and they will act like a giant shovel where they will push these frog skin cells together. It turns out that if you push enough frog skin cells together into a big enough pile, and then you leave that pile alone for about 24 hours, in certain cases, that pile will grow cilia. And cilia are very, very small hairs that beat against the water. And if a pile grows enough cilia or enough hairs, after about 24 hours, that pile will start to move on its own, and in turn push new cells into new piles. And you have a parent Xenobot that makes a child Xenobot, which in some cases can make a grandchild Xenobot, and off you go. So if this technology wasn't surprising or frightening or engaging enough for people as frogbots, now we have self-replicating frogbots. Last thing I wanted to mention about the Xenobots is I've been talking about the Xenobot or the Xenobots. What we as a group invented is not necessarily Xenobots, but a way to create arbitrary numbers of Xenobots. So we've created many, many designs, or the AI has generated many, many designs. And this points towards another aspect of our technological future that I think most of us haven't really discussed very much, which is at the moment, all of our technology, it's all the same. So every cell phone, most cell phones are running the same operating system. Our computers run the same operating systems. The software systems used in our hospitals, they're all running on the same operating system. The fleets of autonomous cars that we're deploying, they're all running exactly the same software. And that makes them particularly vulnerable. Any particular limitation or Achilles heel in that operating system or that software An antagonistic attack by the bad guys or the bad girls that is able to bring down one car or one computer in a hospital can very easily bring down all cars or all computers in a hospital. We're moving towards a future where we can ask the AI to create billions of Xenobots that are snowflakes. No two are exactly alike. And if we deploy large numbers of these machines where no two have the same form or function, they are much safer because they are not a monoculture, they're a heteroculture. And this is often known as the bespoke economy. We're creating technology where every individual piece of technology is bespoke, it's unique. Again, I think that's a place for creativity to come into play and an interesting point of departure for discussions among ourselves and our students. I got a few minutes left, so I wanted to just prime the pump of hopefully a discussion we can have about ideas for curriculum. There's some obvious connections to math curriculum. For example, this is the pizza game that I play with K-12 students that visit UVM over the summer. I asked them to think about all possible pizzas that you could make if you only had one ingredient, pepperoni. The students will usually figure out there's two pizzas. There's one with and without pepperoni. I asked them to think up a second ingredient like broccoli, and I asked them how many pizzas you could make given these two ingredients. And after a little bit of discussion, they realized that there's 4 possible pizzas, with and without pepperoni, with and without broccoli. We throw out a third ingredient. There's 8 pizzas. With 4 ingredients, there's 16 possible pizzas. With 20 ingredients, there are 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, or 2 to the 20 possible pizzas. So we can talk about multiplication. We can talk about exponents by playing the pizza game. And unbeknownst to the students, we're starting to get into combinatorics, which is the space of all possible things given a set of ingredients. So from pizzas, we can go back to Xenobots, which are made out of cubes. If I tell them that there's only one position where you can place a cube, either you place a cube there or you don't, there's 2 possible Xenobots, either a Xenobot made of no cubes or 1 cube. If there are 2 possible locations where the AI can place a cube, there are 4 possible Xenobots. If I left the bacon on here, this should be no forward or no backward cube. If there are 3 possible positions, there are 8 possible Xenobots, and we keep playing this game. And I tell the students that there are actually 800 positions where the AI can place a cube or not when it's designing these Xenobots, which means there are 2 to the 800 possible Xenobots out there. And so we spend a little bit of time thinking about that fantastically large number. And I try and tie it back to this idea of the space of the possible. What are all the possible organisms that Mother Nature has invented or evolved so far? What are all possible technologies that we've invented? And what are some of the technologies out there, like Xenobots, that we haven't even created yet because we haven't explored that particular part of the space of the possible? Again, for the non-STEM students, we take this idea of the space of the possible, and there's some connections with reading curriculum. For the bookworms out there, some of you may have read Jorge Luis's Borges short story called The Library of Babel. The Library of Babel is an imaginary library that contains every possible book. You can imagine, we can play this game with your students, which is to say, imagine books that are just 1 letter long. There are 26 possible books that are 1 letter long. These are all those 26 books. If we think about books that are just 2 letters long, there are 26 times 26 books. That's already a lot of books. If you imagine all possible books that are 410 pages long, that is a very large number of books. The Library of Babel is very, very massive. Somewhere in that library is a book where this is the first page of that book. Somewhere else in the library is this book, which has this as its first page. The students quickly realize that most of the books in the Library of Babel are babble. There's no meaningful information in those books. But even in these, within this library are some other books, like for example, this book, which is obviously Moby Dick. So somewhere in this library is Moby Dick, and somewhere else in this library is this book, which is Moby Dick with one typo in it. So again, this is a way I think for students to think about all the possibilities that are out there and to think about all the books that have already been written. Those books exist somewhere in the Library of Babel, but there are many, many, many more books which are meaningful. They're written in English. They are devastating, exciting, powerful books. They just haven't been found yet. No one has thought up to write such a book. And I think, again, this is a way to sort of inspire the next generation that despite all the creativity and all the things that humans have made over the years, we've basically scratched the surface of what's out there. And part of what technology is doing is to help us create and find some of these other surprising things that are out there. Another example, a more visual example of this idea has popped up very recently over the last few months, which is an AI that can explore the visual Library of Babel. If you imagine all possible photorealistic images, somewhere in that library is a photorealistic image of the tower, is the Eiffel Tower built from bamboo sticks. And somewhere else in that library is the same image, but one pixel slightly different. Why does that matter? It turns out that there is now an AI, it's called DAL-E, which is obviously a nod to Salvador Dali and also Disney's Wall-E. If you have access to DAL-E, you can type in an English sentence like photograph of the Eiffel Tower rebuilt with bamboo sticks, and DALL-E will give you back an arbitrary number of photorealistic images of DALL-E's thoughts about what an Eiffel Tower built from bamboo might look like. DALL-E has also recently generated Banksy graffitos that don't exist in reality, or Darth Vader taking over Europe, or bears drinking beers in Japan, or McSushi Kids combo at McDonald's. I included this last set of images from DALL-E here, which is again that DALL-E or AI can often push into parts of creative spaces that humans might not have thought of. The Xenobots exist in the space of all possible organisms that have never existed on Earth before. We can try and teach AI to go out into those spaces and bring back interesting designs or ideas or images or books that humans never thought to write or draw or create. There are obviously a lot of connections between Xenobots and the biology curriculum. Here's an example that I sometimes show K-12 students, the tree of life, and I ask them to think about, where do Xenobots exist on this tree of life? Are they a new twig that exists on the frog branch in the tree of life, or are they a completely different tree themselves? Okay, we have 8 minutes left. I think I'm going to pause here, and I would love to field questions or engage in a preliminary discussion about curriculum ideas around Xenobots, synthetic biology, and robotics. Thanks very much.
So we have a couple mics in the aisles if you want to ask a question, and so go ahead and find one of these, and you can talk to those, and then I'll repeat it back so that you can hear the question.
Thank you.
But this will make sure everyone else in the room can hear it too. For Xenobot 3.0 was the child functional in Xenobots 3.0?
Yeah, great question. So yes, they were functional in the sense that in that experiment, there was only one function that we wanted the Xenobots to perform, which is to move around and make the next generation of Xenobots. They didn't have any other function except to self-replicate. There's a lot of work on replicating technologies where they do useful work as a side effect of replicating. And that's very important if we want to create machines that have exponential utility, meaning that we create a few numbers of this technology and then deploy them and they become more useful over time. That's incredibly useful, but of course, incredibly dangerous because, as Hollywood has shown us, they can possibly get out of control. Xenobots 3 are meant to be a scientific testbed for studying the conditions under which replicating systems spiral out of control and the tools that we can deploy to snuff them out before they spiral out of control. Obviously, most of you are wearing masks because we're not very good as a society at regulating biology or technology that spirals out of control. Yep, great question. Thank you.
I'm wondering, I loved when you mentioned the idea of getting students more interested in science, especially if they don't think of themselves as scientists. So I love that idea, but I'm also looking at the work that you're doing, which is very, very sciencey. So how can we do more to build those bridges and help students think of themselves as scientists, even when they might not think of themselves very good at math and science?
Yep. Thank you for the question. I heard that perfectly, Jeff. It's a great question. I don't have the answer. And again, as you mentioned, this is a challenging thing to do. One of the things that's happening in AI and robotics is that it's becoming more accessible to young folks and people that are not necessarily technically inclined. I showed you Quadrupedia, this four-legged robot. That's actually, you can buy that off the shelf. It's about $80 a pop. I'm happy to work with people if they're interested in buying some of this technology for the classroom. I also showed you DALL-E, which is an AI available on the web. So students can quote unquote talk to DALL-E, or they can work with AI to create images never before created by human beings. So I think one of the things we try and do with robots, and some of my colleagues are doing with AI, is bringing the students together where they work together as a team. There's one human, one robot, there's 3 students, there's 2 robots, there's 1 AI. So this idea of teamwork, that it's not, us and them, the technology and the students, which, can be obviously very, very scary or very antagonistic, that in a very real sense, it's going to be humans and technology together creating the technology of the future. So there's a lot of these emerging technologies that allow students to get their hands dirty without having to write code, without having to write equations. I think that there's lots of opportunities there for connecting with those students, but it is still a challenge. I agree.
So first of all, as a sci-fi fan, thank you for making self-replicating robots. As a horror fan, thank you for doing it without brain cells. But that does raise a really interesting question. How do they move and how easily understandable is that in a K-12 setting?
Yeah, I heard the first part of that. How do they move and
how do we translate that into a K-12 setting? Like, how easily understandable is it?
Yeah, great question. It's not easily understandable. And again, this is something I try and bring back to the students, is that obviously in science, when you answer one question, which is, can you make a Xenobot? The answer is yes. It reveals, dozens of other questions. It turns out that these Xenobots move without brain cells because of the heart tissue. These heart cells are quote unquote trying to synchronize with their neighbors, and they're being partially successful. So by rearranging these Lego bricks, you can get very rich behavior, the way that these Xenobots move, because these motors or these machines are synchronizing or failing to synchronize. You mentioned that we're not making Xenobots with brain cells. That's true, but that may not be true for very much longer.
I had a question about the energy for these Xenobots. How do you feed them?
Yep. I'm sorry, Jeff, could you repeat?
So, yeah, the question was about the energy for the Xenobots and how do you feed them?
Yeah, great question. And again, a lot of the students ask the same question. So these are cells taken from basically frog egg, and eggs have within them very energy rich materials, which is egg yolk. At this stage in development, when the cells are extracted, these frog cells have very small amounts of egg yolk inside the cells, and they're basically eating or metabolizing that yolk. And the heart cells are turning that into motion. They use up those energy stores after about 7 to 10 days. And after about 7 to 10 days, these xenobots start moving and they start to rot and die away like any living tissue does. We had a particularly interesting discussion with some grade sixes about whether the xenobots die. So when I told them after 7 to 10 days the xenobots stop moving, they asked, are they dying? And I answered that we don't know. That the standard definition of death doesn't really apply to the xenobots. Another example of, again, this sort of blurring dichotomous thinking. Xenobots are not living, not dead, not machines, not biology. There's something new that's in between.
Well, I think we have hit the 9 o'clock hour. My brain's a bit overstuffed right now, but I think that was the hope and the intent for today's talk. I want to thank you again for coming and joining us through the video, and I think challenging a lot of people's thoughts about both art and technology and science. It reminds me a lot of ideas about just even video gaming and how the video game industry has drawn in coders to write the games, but artists to draw the games, and musicians to compose the music that gets played in the games. And it has become a full-on STEAM industry, right? So it isn't just geeks playing games, it's all kinds of folks working together. So I think there's a lot of really interesting kind of ideas there, and I hope everyone that your brains are going, we are going to be transferring the drawings back to the Champlain room and figure out a way to kind of display them for you. And there's also a page that Beth has set up for you to kind of continue to pose questions and thoughts, and that you can add to those. So try not to add to the other ones, but for this sheet here, this is the one that will be kind of some user generated content that you can go ahead and add to it. So we'll hopefully get that over there in the next 30 minutes or so as we transfer things across. So thanks again, Josh, for joining us. And for the rest of us here, I think the next round of sessions begins at 9:15.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day.